Hello everyone, this lecture is on part 5 of The Plague by Albert Camus. By this point of the novel, the plague is on its way out and the narrative is slowing down. There are fewer events and more reflection. This general mood of closure is indeed accentuated by one final memorable event, namely Tarrus's death. We know that the plague manifests itself in two distinct manners, first bubonic and later pneumonic. As for Tarrus's case, quote, the strange thing was that Tarrus showed symptoms of both varieties of plague at once, unquote. A minor detail this may be, we have no reason not to read it textually. We have seen three other characters suffer from the plague: Monsieur Othon's little boy, Father Paneloux, and Grand. Their cases should help us make sense of Tarrus's case. With Monsieur Othon's son, the bare truth of the plague was exposed for all to see, the truth being absurdity by which the boy's suffering and death had no meaning whatsoever. Father Paneloux, who may or may not have suffered the plague, died in a doubtful case, and we read that doubt in relation to his search for religious truth, God as truth that would explain all seemingly contingent events in the world. He died in that search, that is, without arriving at the truth, or so the text seems to draw its conclusion. Grand, on the other hand, was resurrected against all odds, and that marked precisely the beginning of the decline of the plague. In this way, Rieux was proven at least partially right in his irrational belief that Grand was incompatible with the plague, that he was proof of a sort against an absurd disaster like the plague. This is a strange moment where the contingency of the plague and of human existence is momentarily confronted by a certain meaning represented by Rieux's intuition. Importantly, this meaning is not attached to any interest pursuable in reality, nor does it stay to guarantee anything beyond this moment. Nonetheless, it is something a man in suffering can grasp for a brief respite, like a breath of fresh air. In this series of cases, what is Tarrus's significance? The narrator observes, quote, it was as if the pestilence, hounded away by cold, the street lamps and the crowd had fled from the depths of the town and taken shelter in this warm room and was launching its last offensive at Tarrus's inert body, unquote. We may extend this imagination and say that it is as if Tarrus were calling the remnants of the plague into his body to carry them off to death. Tarrus's sacrificial death is another meaning that the text intimates, which offers Rieux a briefest and most private respite from absurd existence. The text remains uninterested in any discourse of hope. Quite to the contrary, it is rather emphatic that the plague can never be gotten rid of. Quote, the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, unquote. Like Rieux, we may just briefly entertain the idea of Grand's resurrection and Tarrus's sacrifice. The text allows this flight of imagination, but does not cease to be grounded in the reality of human existence where the absurd reigns. At this point, the concepts of chance and luck return. We have commented on these concepts a number of times since The Stranger. This is Dr. Rieux reflecting on Tarrus's by all signs hopeless case. Quote, the only way in which he might help was to provide opportunities for the beneficence of chance, which too often stays dormant unless roused to action. Luck was an ally he could not dispense with, unquote. If this sounds like Rieux hoping, hope in this context is not the kind wanted by cultural discourses. Rieux is not thinking, Tarrus is such a great person, he has done so much for other people, he deserves to survive this trial. No, that would be the kind of hope that we are very familiar with. Hope that is not uncalculated, that needs to be deserved. This is not the kind of hope that Rieux is invoking here. He's invoking the hope of chance, of luck, hope that is firmly grounded in the contingent. Tarrus may just be saved, but only by chance. So he's calling on the other side of the absurd. On the other side of the bleak facade of contingency, there is luck or chance, whereby situations can simply turn upside down. And this is the kind of hope Rieux is relying on, and nothing more than that. We also know that Tarrus is himself a character who doesn't know, quote, hope's solace, unquote, as Rieux said. He refused to resort to the facile comfort of hope, but persisted in wakeful confrontation with the absurd, the contingent. Hoping in the conventional discursive sense is contradicting the truth of existence. The only way to hope without contradicting the truth of existence would be to invoke chance or luck, which is what Rieux is doing. Some of Tarrus's final thoughts are worth examining at this point. We have direct access to them because they are recorded in his journal. Quote, Tarrus lays stress above all on Madame Rieux's self-effacement, her way of explaining things in the simplest possible words, her predilection for a special window at which she always sat in the early evening, holding herself rather straight, her hands at rest, her eyes fixed on the quiet street below, until twilight filled the room and she showed among the gathering shadows as a motionless black form which gradually merged into the invading darkness. He remarks on the lightness with which she moved from one room to the other, on her kindness, though no precise instances had come to his notice, he discerned its gentle glow in all she said and did, on the gift she had of knowing everything without apparently taking thought, and lastly, that dim and silent though she was, she quailed before no light, even the garish light of the plague, unquote. What's important here is the connection between what Tarrus refers to as self-effacement and simple words. This reminds us, of course, of Grand, a figure that has all the signs of insignificance. In his case, just like in Madame Rieux's case, self-effacement has nothing to do with humility as we understand it, but rather everything to do with not compromising his principles. He refuses to resort to the conventional use of language, especially for the purpose of putting himself forward. So there is the connection between Madame Rieux and Grand, which is the continuity from self-effacement to simple words to quiet dignity and kindness. The simple words also remind us of the Spanish mother of Marcel and Louis. She also had a simple way of understanding things and expressing her views, which somehow touched Humbert. Now, Tahu writes about another maternal figure. Quote, at this point, Tahu's handwriting began to fall off oddly. Indeed, the following lines were almost illegible. And as if in confirmation of this loss of grip upon himself, the last lines of the entry deal for the first time in the diary with his personal life. She reminds me of my mother. What I loved most in mother was her self-effacement, her dimness, as they say. And it's she I've always wanted to get back to. It happened 8 years ago, but I can't say she died. She only effaced herself a trifle more than usual. And when I looked around, she was no longer there. Unquote. This is a very moving passage. Tahu's description of his mother's death as effacing herself a trifle more than usual is profoundly beautiful. What does this say about her? In her, the distinction between life and death itself was dim. The mother's dimness is the same dimness that traverses the line between life and death. Put differently, what her dimness effaces is the distinct line between life and death, which most people take for granted. On the other side of the quiet strength of these mothers is what he calls sainthood, the quality of being a saint. We talked about the asthma patient as a saint. Now let us consider the man who spits on cats with the same regularity as that with which the asthma patient counts his dried peas. On that old gentleman, Tahu's thoughts are as follows, quote, but at the ritual hour, the shutters stayed closed, and never once did Tahu see them open on the following days. He drew the rather odd conclusion that the old fellow was either dead or vexed. If vexed, the reason being that he had thought that he was right, and the plague had put him in the wrong. If dead, the question was, as in the case of the old asthmatic, had he been a saint? Tahu hardly thought so, but he found in the old man's case a pointer. Perhaps, he wrote, we can only reach approximations of sainthood, in which case we just make shift with a mild, benevolent diabolism. Unquote. The old man who spits on cats and the old man who counts dried peas, these two men are considered by Tahu as possible cases of sainthood. What does it mean then to be a saint? Based on the given examples, we can conjecture that sainthood has to do with being at peace with everything. These gentlemen are not disturbed by the goings-on in the world, the plague most strikingly. When it is not possible to be at peace with everything, the next best thing is to try not to murder unintentionally. We are familiar with this determination to desist from unintentional murder. Tahu spoke of it in telling his life story to Ryu. This desistance may be related to what he means by mild, benevolent diabolism here. We all take part in diabolism. We all do devil's work one way or another. These old men settled for the least harmful kind of diabolism. We remember Tahu's conversation with Ryu. He said that he wanted to be a saint. Perhaps that was his way of concealing his fatigue, even from the work of benevolent diabolism. Simultaneously, we shall not forget, being a saint is opposed to being a man. To be a man is to take part, to take action in love, exile, and suffering, the three keywords that the text repeats at the end of the novel. Let us now consider some of the other reflections, indeed afterthoughts, as the narrative is heading toward the end. First, there is the news that Ryu's wife has passed away. The news arrives the morning after Tahu's death, to add to Ryu's general sense of loss. As if all the deaths he has seen already were not enough, it is Tahu's death that brings home Ryu's understanding of this most radical event in human existence. Quote, the doctor could not tell if Tahu had found peace, now that all was over. But for himself, he had a feeling that no peace was possible to him henceforth, any more than there can be an armistice for a mother bereaved of her son, or for a man who buries his friend, unquote. No matter that the plague is over, life is back to, quote unquote, normal. There's no peace waiting for Ryu. Between the two deaths, Ryu has something to say about love as well. Quote, at that moment, he knew what his mother was thinking, and that she loved him. But he knew, too, that to love someone means relatively little, or rather, that love is never strong enough to find the words befitting it. Thus, he and his mother would always love each other silently, and one day she or he would die without ever, all their lives long, have gone farther than this by way of making their affection known. Thus, too, he had lived at Tahu's side, and Tahu had died this evening, without their friendships having had time to enter fully into the life of either, unquote. What does he mean by this remarkable statement that to love someone means relatively little? He gives us the answer in the very next sentence. Love is never strong enough to find the words befitting it. The key words are means and words. Love, no matter how strong it is, how remarkable or extraordinary, its meaning is ever confined to language. Love is of the world, and the world is mediated by language. Language is, of course, a marvelous instrument with which we can engage our absurd existence. We are reading one such instance here. But language can also add to the absurdity of existence, and we have seen plenty of examples of the violence that language can inflict. In this context, it is not surprising that Ryu's reaction to the news of his wife's death is rather simple. Quote, and he knew, in saying this, that this suffering was nothing new. For many months and for the last 2 days, it was the self-same suffering going on and on, unquote. It's the same suffering. There's no difference between the suffering of his friend's death and the suffering of his wife's death. His love for them, moreover, is not different from his love for his mother, or indeed anyone he has encountered during the crisis. All these instances of love are connected to one another by the absurdity of existence, and it would be absurd to rank them in terms of importance. This is Ryu's humanity. Now let's move on to Cotard. He gets arrested in this chapter. With the signs of life returning to normality, anxiety rises in him, to the point of deranging him. He's afraid of returning to the status of the condemned perhaps even to death. In the wake of Cotard's dramatic arrest, the narrator states, quote, perhaps it was more painful to think of a guilty man than of a dead man, unquote. The most obvious way of interpreting this statement would be to say that a dead man no longer suffers, and therefore it is easier to think of him. A living man is always liable to become a guilty man. You never know when a living man can become guilty. More than that, what is a guilty man finally guilty of? Of course, we can name this or that crime, murder, stealing, sexual violence, etc., etc. At the level of the philosophical thinking that we have been following, every one of these crimes is a revolt in its own way, conditioned by absurd existence. We may say that a criminal revolts in an erroneous way, but to determine him or her to be guilty is a difficult matter, to the extent that we are all guilty, according to Tarrou, among others. Take Cotard. He shoots at innocent people now. That is obviously criminal. At the same time, what motivates him? Anxiety, precisely. The weight of his absurd existence that he cannot endure with his little body. The narrator basically refuses to condemn Cotard or indeed any other man. He rather declares compassion for all guilty men, which is the same as all men. There is some news about Grand as well. Quote, on his doorstep, Grand bade the doctor good night. He was going to put in an evening's work, he said. Just as he was starting up the stairs, he added that he had written to John and was feeling much happier. Also, he had made a fresh start with his phrase, I've cut out all the adjectives, unquote. So this is a man who still carries a twinkle in his eye. Our question is, what does it mean to cut out all the adjectives? First of all, we want to think about what adjectives do. Are not adjectives the part of speech most conducive to hoarding, so to speak? We can always add more and more adjectives. We often do so with the assumption that it would clarify the meaning. By the same token, adjectives are most indicative of the insufficiency of language. The more inadequate a description feels, the more adjectives we tend to add. They are so readily available, but the more we use them, the more we demonstrate that language is falling short. Recall Grand's use of adjectives in that famous first sentence. It is packed with adjectives. What is he doing? He's trying to capture the scene in all its sensory vividness. All he can do is to add more adjectives, and he's never satisfied. It's a brilliant decision to cut out all the adjectives, whatever other kind of problems he might be faced with. As important as this decision on adjectives is the fact that he was able to write that letter to John, his ex-wife, the letter that he wanted so long to write but wasn't able to. This small achievement came out of the plague. The plague has done something in Grand's service. What about Humbert? I quote, if only he could put the clock back and be once more the man who, at the outbreak of the epidemic, had had only one thought and one desire, to escape and return to the woman he loved. But that, he knew, was out of the question now. He had changed too greatly. The plague had forced on him a detachment, which, try as he might, he couldn't think away, and which, like a formless fear, haunts his mind. Almost, he thought, the plague had ended too abruptly. He hadn't had time to pull himself together. Happiness was bearing down on him, full speed, the event outrunning expectation. Humbert understood that all would be restored to him in a flash, and joy break on him like a flame with which there is no dallying, unquote. This idea that the plague had ended too abruptly, or the event is outrunning his expectations, reveals the individual existence as incommensurable with this or that desire. What one wants in the confinement of time and space cannot possibly convey what one's existence aspires to. What is the great change that has happened to him? He says detachment. And we don't need to think of this word negatively. It doesn't mean that he cares less about love or happiness. It may be the best to understand this word as synonymous with abstraction. Abstraction that the plague represents, that absurd existence represents, and that Rieu's revolt represents. That abstraction has become part of Humbert's relation to the world now. This is a lot more than what we can expect from the ordinary people of Oran. The following exchange between Cotard and Tarrou dates from before they were completely assured of the end of the plague. Quote, was it supposed, he asked, that the plague wouldn't have changed anything and the life of the town would go on as before, exactly as if nothing had happened? Tarrou thought that the plague would have changed things and not changed them. Naturally, our fellow citizens' strongest desire was and would be to behave as if nothing had changed. And for that reason, nothing would be changed, in a sense. But to look at it from another angle, one can't forget everything, however great one's wish to do so. The plague was bound to have leave traces, anyhow, in people's hearts, unquote. This is a great summary. Things won't change because people don't want to change things. But we cannot really say that nothing has changed because the plague leaves traces. What Humbert and Grand achieved is already quite a lot more than what they themselves could have imagined for the traces of the plague. Let us conclude our discussion of the novel by returning to the man at the center of the story, Dr. Rieux. We finally learn that the anonymous narrator of the chronicle is indeed Dr. Rieux, as some of us probably have already suspected. He now tells us what enabled him to chronicle the events during the reign of the plague. Quote, thus he can truly say there was not one of their anxieties in which he did not share, no predicament of theirs that was not his, unquote. He has the story not as a possessor of the real truth or finer details of the events, but as one among all. All the anxieties, despairs, and even false hopes he shared with everyone else. His is the common denominator of human existence. Solidarity arises there. Meanwhile, he remains a doctor, and therefore, quote, there was no question of his taking a day off. Sick men had no holidays, unquote. The plague has ended, and that doesn't change anything about Rieu's duty to reality. He is back to work. He pays a visit to the asthma patient who counts dried peas. This saintly figure sums up the meaning of the plague, which is really no meaning. Quote, but what does that mean, plague? Just life, no more than that, unquote. This is a saintly summary, and Rieux the man reflects on it as follows. Quote, Yes, the old fellow had been right. These people were just the same as ever. But this was at once their strength and their innocence. And it was on this level, beyond all grief, that Ryu could feel himself at one with them. And it was in the midst of shouts rolling against the terrace wall in massive waves that waxed in volume and duration, while cataracts of colored fire fell thicker through the darkness, that Dr. Ryu resolved to compile this chronicle, so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure, and to state quite simply what we learn in a time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. Unquote. The important point is that Ryu refuses to be one of those who hold their peace, which is to say, he refuses to be a saint. This is where a man comes out ahead of a saint, and that, we might say, is the desire of the text. With this, we conclude our reading of the novel. Thank you and goodbye.